There is a word we still use today for a particular kind of torment: to be tantalized. It means to have something you desperately want held just out of reach, close enough to see and smell and almost touch, but never close enough to grasp. Most people who use that word have no idea that it comes from the name of a real figure in Greek myth, and that the punishment behind it is one of the cruelest the ancient world ever imagined. The man was named Tantalus, and he was no ordinary mortal. He was a son of Zeus himself, a king so favored by the gods that he was invited to eat at their own table, something almost no human being was ever allowed to do. He had everything: wealth, power, the friendship of the immortals, a place among them. And he threw it all away in a single act so monstrous that it still has the power to shock 3,000 years later. What could a man possibly do with the gods themselves as his dinner guests that would earn him an eternity of hunger and thirst he could never satisfy? That is the story you'll hear tonight: how the most fortunate mortal who ever lived became the most wretched of all, and why his name became a word for endless, hopeless longing. If you enjoy these stories, take a moment to subscribe. It genuinely keeps this channel alive, and tell me in the comments which myth you'd like next. Now settle in, and let's meet the man who had everything. Tantalus was the king of a rich land near Mount Sipylus, in the region the Greeks called Lydia, far to the east. By birth, he was a son of Zeus, and the gods looked on him with a favor they showed to almost no other mortal. His kingdom was wealthy beyond measure. The old stories say his mountains were full of gold, and that he was among the richest men who had ever lived. But his true wealth was something no gold could buy. Of all the mortals on the earth, Tantalus alone was welcomed into the company of the gods as a friend. He was invited up to Olympus to share in their feast, to sit at the table of the immortals and taste the food that kept them deathless, the ambrosia and the nectar that no human tongue was ever meant to touch. The gods even came down, on occasion, to dine in his halls in return, treating him almost as one of their own. Think for a moment about what that meant. To the Greeks, the distance between gods and men was the widest distance there was, and here was a mortal who had been allowed to cross it, to sit among the deathless ones as a guest, and very nearly an equal. It was the greatest honor imaginable. And it should have been more than enough for any man. But Tantalus, for reasons the old stories struggle to explain, was not content. Something in that extraordinary privilege began to spoil Tantalus from the inside. Perhaps it was simple arrogance, the feeling, after so many feasts among the immortals, that he was truly their equal and bound by none of the rules that governed lesser men. Whatever the cause, he began to abuse the trust the gods had placed in him, and he did it in ways that grew steadily worse. The oldest versions tell several stories of his betrayals. In some, he stole the ambrosia and nectar from the god's own table and carried it back down to earth, sharing the food of immortality with his mortal friends, giving away the god's deepest secret as if it were a party trick. In others, he repeated the private conversations of the gods, the things he had overheard at their table, broadcasting to the world matters that were never meant for mortal ears. He took what was sacred and treated it as common. He took the trust of the immortals and spent it carelessly again and again, as though there could never be a reckoning. The gods, remarkably, seemed to have tolerated a great deal. But Tantalus was building towards something far worse than theft or gossip, a single act that no amount of favor could ever excuse. He decided, for reasons that remain genuinely disturbing, to put the gods themselves to a test. He wanted to find out whether they were truly all-knowing. And the test he devised was the most terrible thing a father could do. Tantalus invited the gods to a great banquet in his own halls, a feast to repay all the hospitality they had shown him. They accepted, as they always had, and prepared to come down and dine with their favored mortal once again. But this time, Tantalus had a hidden purpose. He wanted to know, once and for all, whether the gods really saw everything, whether their famous wisdom was real or merely a story they told about themselves. And so he planned to set before them a dish so horrifying that, if they ate it without knowing, it would prove they were not all-knowing at all. Here, the old stories ask us to face something almost unbearable. Tantalus had a young son, a boy named Pelops, whom he loved. And it was his own son that he chose for the test. He killed the boy and butchered him and cooked the pieces into a stew, and he served that dish to the gods at his table to see whether they would notice what they were eating. It is one of the darkest moments in all of Greek myth, and the storytellers do not linger on the details because they do not need to. The horror is in the idea itself, a father destroying his own child, not in a fit of madness, but coldly, deliberately, as a clever little experiment to embarrass his guests. This was the act that finally broke the long patience of the gods. Of course they knew. The moment the dish was set before them, the gods saw exactly what it was, and a horror and a fury swept around that table, such as the world had never seen. Not one of the immortals would touch the meal. They recoiled from it in disgust, their friendship with Tantalus turning in an instant to revulsion. The old stories make a point of telling us that all of them saw through the trick at once, every single one. All but one. The goddess Demeter, it is said, was so lost in her own grief that she alone failed to notice. This was during the time when her daughter Persephone had been carried off to the underworld, and Demeter wandered the world half blind with sorrow, barely aware of what was around her. Distracted by her endless mourning, she absent-mindedly ate a single piece of the terrible meal, a portion from the boy's shoulder, before the truth became clear. That one detail mattered enormously, as we will see. But for Tantalus, the experiment was over, and it had failed completely. He had wanted to prove the gods were not all-knowing, and instead he had proven the opposite in the most damning way possible. They had seen everything, and now they turned the full weight of their anger on him. But the gods did not only punish. Before they dealt with Tantalus, they did something merciful and strange. They brought the murdered boy back to life. Gathering up what remained of poor Pelops, the immortals restored him, knitting him whole again and breathing life back into his body, so that he rose up living and, well, a boy given a second chance at the life his own father had stolen from him. There was only one piece missing. Because Demeter, in her grief, had eaten part of the boy's shoulder, that portion could not be recovered, and so the gods fashioned a new shoulder for him out of gleaming ivory, smooth and white, and fitted it seamlessly into place. From that day on, Pelops carried a shoulder of ivory, the mark of what had been done to him and the sign of his rescue by the gods. He went on to live a long and important life. In time, he became a great king, and the entire southern half of Greece, the Peloponnese, still bears his name to this day, the island of Pelops. So the boy survived and even prospered. The one who would not escape was the one who had caused it all. Tantalus had murdered his son to test the gods, and the gods had undone the murder. Now there was nothing left to do but pass judgment on the father. The gods cast Tantalus down. They stripped from him every honor he had ever been given, his place at their table, his friendship with the immortals, his very life, and they sent his soul down into the deepest, darkest pit of the underworld, a place called Tartarus. Tartarus was not the ordinary land of the dead where most souls went. It lay far lower and far worse, a dungeon of the cosmos reserved for the very greatest offenders, those whose crimes were so terrible that an ordinary death could never be enough. It was here that the gods imprisoned their worst enemies, and it was here that Tantalus would spend the rest of eternity. But the gods did not simply lock him away in the dark. For a crime as deliberate and as monstrous as his, they devised a punishment with a terrible kind of poetry to it, one designed to match, exactly, the nature of what he had done. Tantalus had been a man of endless appetite. He had been given the food of the gods themselves, and still he had wanted more, hungered for more, grasped for more, until his hunger drove him to the unthinkable. So the gods gave him an eternity in which he would do nothing but hunger and thirst, surrounded forever by the very things he could never have. They set Tantalus standing in a clear, cool pool of fresh water that rose all the way up to his chin. Above his head, the branches of fruit trees hung low and heavy, laden with ripe pears and apples and figs and sweet dark fruit, dangling just before his face. He was a man dying of thirst, standing in water, and a man starving beneath a feast of fruit. And here was the torment. Whenever Tantalus bent his head to drink, the water would drain away from him, sinking down into the black earth until the ground at his feet went dry, leaving him gasping with the pool just out of reach. And whenever he stretched his hand up toward the fruit, a sudden wind would toss the branches upward, lifting them away from his grasping fingers, so that they swayed forever just beyond him. Hunger he could not satisfy. Thirst he could not quench. Forever. In some versions of the story, the gods added one more refinement of cruelty, a great stone balanced above his head, perpetually about to fall, so that even in his endless craving he could never know a moment's peace, always braced for a blow that never quite came. This is where the word comes from, to be tantalized, to reach and reach for something that withdraws the very instant you touch it. And this is where Tantalus remains, the old stories say, to this very day. It is worth asking why the Greeks reached for this particular punishment and why it has lasted so long in our imagination. They could have given Tantalus fire or chains or some monster to torment him. Instead, they gave him longing, pure, endless, unsatisfiable longing, and in doing so, they put their finger on something that feels uncomfortably close to home. Tantalus had been given more than almost any mortal in history. He sat at the table of the gods. He wanted for nothing, and it was not enough. His hunger was not really a hunger of the body at all, but a hunger of the spirit, a craving that no gift could ever fill, and it drove him in the end to destroy the very things he should have treasured most. The gods simply made that inner condition visible and eternal. There is a hard truth buried in his story, and it is one the Greeks understood very well, that the most dangerous appetite is the one that can never be satisfied, the wanting that only grows the more it is fed. Tantalus stands forever in his pool, beneath his fruit, reaching for what he cannot have, and the unsettling thing is how easy it is to recognize the posture. If this is the kind of story you want more of, take a moment to subscribe, and tell me in the comments which myth I should tell next. Sleep well.